I was always perplexed and still am perplexed by brands wanting to focus on local creators. Oftentimes, just the different countries within a global company still haven't, I think, gotten as efficient as they can in terms of really scaling in a meaningful way. For example, I often hear from Canadian brands, well, I don't want to pay for American eyeballs. Well, at the end of the day, if you're working with a creator, that's inevitable, right? And vice versa. I want to get the industry to get to a place where it really is data driven. It really is where a creator's audience is based. And how do you just get really smart about that?
Welcome to Sponsored Post Podcast, behind the lens of how influential content is made. I am Justin Moore. I'm the founder and CEO of Trending Family, which is an influencer marketing agency that launches campaigns with family-friendly influencers. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by Rick Matthews, who is the former VP of Kin Community Canada, which was recently acquired by Chorus Entertainment. Welcome, Rick.
Thanks, Justin. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for hopping on the show. So why don't we kick it off and tell me a little bit about your background and your story and how you got into this space.
Sure. So I've been in the media industry for over 10 years, and I started in broadcast, primarily in the reality and lifestyle space. And before launching Kin Community here in Canada, I was the executive producer of one of Canada's most popular daytime talk shows called Stephen and Chris, which was also actually syndicated in the US. And I would say probably that the best equivalency would probably be Rachel Ray, just to give your listeners context. And so the show obviously had, obviously a very strong presence on broadcast, but it also had a very strong presence on social and digital as well. And a number of the experts that we had that sort of came on the show regularly, I would say were sort of some of the, earliest quote unquote influencers, although I hate that term. We can talk about that later. But as I was sort of in that broadcast space, I obviously, like most people, saw the growth that was happening explosively on social and also digital. And the show was also a massive destination for Canadians in that regard too. So sort of as things progressed, I just realized I wanted to lean into that side of the business in a much more focused way. And as luck would have it, and sort of how these things play out, Chorus Entertainment, which is one of the largest networks in Canada, they led a Series C round of funding for Kin, which is obviously the headquarters are in LA. And the two companies formed a strategic sales partnership here in Canada, and I was brought in to launch and scale the business. So it was kind of the perfect opportunity given my background, my skills, and my interest. And that's what I had been doing for the last 5 years until Chorus just recently acquired the Canadian division of the company, which is really every entrepreneur's dream.
Yeah, super interesting. And so tell me a little bit about what the influencer marketing landscape looks like right now in Canada and globally, because I know you were also managing Australia and other territories at one point as well. So what does it look like around the world in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is it's probably not dissimilar to how it is in a lot of places. I'll speak to Canada first. I think the thing that's unique about the Canadian market is that a lot of it tends to be very centralized in Toronto. So unlike US, where, influencers kind of are based across the country, really the influencer marketing industry is really based in Toronto, with a lot of the creators primarily based here as well. That doesn't mean there's not creators across the country, but it just means that in terms of sort of where they're centralized, it tends to be in Toronto. And Australia, I mean, it's like everything too. In Australia, they were based around Sydney and Melbourne, major centers. But I would say what's really unique about the Canadian space is that it's really sort of centralized in one sort of place. And that just means in terms of, because a lot of the media companies are based here, a lot of the agencies are based here, the industry really is based here in Toronto. I think the business has grown and scaled very quickly here.
Super interesting. And you've spoken before about how localized business still remains. Why do you think brands are still kind of hung up on only using local influencers? Like, for example, a US creator may have like a big percentage of their audience in Canada, right? But a Canadian brand doesn't necessarily want to work with the US creator as much. And I think we see that quite a bit around the world. A brand has in their mind that they need to work with like a local influencer for it to be relevant to their audience. Do you feel that's the case?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you and I are completely on the same page on that. It's always baffled me, to be honest. I remember when I first really got into this side of the business, I was sort of surprised because, to your point, if you look at the data and you can sort of see where someone's audiences are based, the largest percentage of their audience is usually going to be in the US, but it also can be, in their home country. And then there's a smattering of other places where they have a lot of reach and influence. And even in places where maybe it's not even the same language, right? Because content's global. I was always perplexed and still am perplexed by brands wanting to focus on local creators. And I think in part that's just because I think as a marketer, you just believe that creators from your area of the world are going to speak to the audiences that you're trying to reach in sort of more quote unquote localized way, or that the sort of similarities and cultural references will all be the same. So I just think maybe for some marketers, I think that that's maybe too big a leap for them to make in terms of, to your point, using an American creator in Canada, which we've done, and vice versa. A number of Canadian creators that I've worked with over the years have also been featured in US campaigns and vice versa. But I want to get the industry to get to a place where it really is data driven. It really is where a creator's audience's base is the first point of reference. And then you sort of go through the chain of, do I want to work with this creator?
Interesting. And so talk me through some of the challenges about working with global brands who have so many different divisions. I mean, like in the US, like a major conglomerate, let's say CPG company or something. I mean, they have, a whole host of agencies. They have different, regional headquarters and different marketing teams that all have different KPIs. And I got to imagine that it's especially challenging when you've got, different geographic divisions across country lines. Let's say Walmart, for example. Are there able to be synergies when you're doing campaigns that are running in both places, or how does that work?
For sure. Well, let me answer your question in two parts. The first is obviously just sort of the local, if you look at it from a local perspective, right? Just even country specific. I find, and I'm sure this is the case in the US as well, that where influencer marketing lands across an agency landscape or a brand's landscape hasn't really quite landed or become formalized yet. And by that, I mean, some brands have brought it entirely in-house. Some brands leave their influencer marketing campaigns to their media agency. Then the creative agency sort of gets their nose out of joint sometimes, or sometimes I've even seen them lead it. And then last year, then you have sort of the PR agencies that are then kind of doing the sort of influencer, scale play, because it aligns with sort of the way that their side of the business has tended to function. So I find that even just on a country level, where our business lands hasn't even landed there yet. So there's a lot of infighting or confusion about where it really lands. And I think that just inherently creates an issue around efficiency. But then if you scale that up, and then to your point, you look at, cases where why couldn't you, for example, have a major CPG company or a Walmart have a campaign or leverage what they're doing across all of North America, let's say, in cases where the marketing objectives kind of align. I actually had this happen with a major retailer as well, where this was, again, one of those instances where we had a very large Canadian creator, which obviously had a massive American audience as well, working with a major retailer. And then we approached the Canadian division of that retailer because we, from having offices in both countries, knew that the objectives for this holiday campaign were basically essentially the same. To say, listen, Canadian agency, why don't you approach your American partners and say, listen, let's just scale this. Let's just version this, right? Because the creator that we were working with was completely capable of, doing a version that would speak more to the Canadian audience if that was really required. And then we could put together a sort of a smart media strategy that would amplify that within Canada. And even something where, in that instance, where the marketing objectives lined up across the US and Canadian divisions, we couldn't get it across the finish line. And I think that that's in part because there's that inherent sort of competition amongst, even within the same companies across countries. So, for example, I often hear from Canadian brands, well, I don't want to pay for American eyeballs. Well, at the end of the day, if you're working with a creator, that's inevitable, right? And vice versa. American side of a business will say, well, Canada can do their own thing, or Australia can do their own thing, or UK can do their own thing. And so I sort of find that oftentimes just the different countries within a global company still haven't, I think, gotten as efficient as they can in terms of really scaling in a meaningful way. And that comes back to our larger point, though, that we spoke about earlier, which is where is a creator's audience based and how do you just get really smart about that?
Super interesting. I mean, something you mentioned initially about it not really being formalized yet of, who's owning the influencer marketing spend. I think it also makes it even more complicated because of how saturated the space is with so many different influencer agencies and platforms and multi-channel networks. And I think for a brand, it's so overwhelming to not only say, okay, let's decide that we're going to create an influencer strategy or something, but now it's now what, right? Do we hire in-house? what agency would we go to? Do we hire, do we task our agency of record with doing this? Like, I feel like it's just so complicated, and I'm not sure if there's going to be a reckoning at some point. I mean, there's already been some consolidation with some of the influencer platforms like Tap Influence and Izea, for example. But like, I don't know. I feel for brands these days, there's no real clear recommendation to give,
Yeah, I agree. And it's exactly it. Like I would hate to be a brand manager sometimes, I think, because just in terms of how do you, to your point, have an impact in a meaningful way or make sure that your campaign's hitting its KPIs when there are so many players. And also too, cost comes into play here, right? Because all those players you mentioned, they're all adding their own margin on top of a particular rate. And that sort of then gets even more convoluted. What are the actual measures of success? And to me, the instances that I have seen where a brand has been most successful is where they've taken the time. And look, maybe you do this on an annual basis. It's not a forever kind of thing, or maybe even quarterly. But like brands that have gone and said, okay, for the next year, who are 10 to 20 creators across platforms that really speak to our brand, our demographic, and what we're going to be trying to push this year. And then really sitting down with those creators and going, okay, let's create a meaningful long-term partnership. And so like specific examples that come to mind are like TELUS, which is one of the largest mobility cell phone companies here. They have really done that. They have a roster of people that they use consistently. So that also from an audience perspective, that obviously makes sense because then the creator's audience becomes very familiar with the product and it creates an opportunity to integrate a product into their content in a way that's not so, I'm being paid to do this one video and I must get this push in. They can be much more organic over the course of a campaign. Subway, another perfect example. They have like 5 key creators that are the ones that they use that are their go-tos. And then they supplement it with other creators that may be sort of playing specifically to what they're trying to push in that particular campaign. So that to me feels like the right way to go because it puts an onus on the brand and their agencies to do the homework required to pick the best people, vet their audience to make sure there's not bots and all that stuff. But then it also just ensures that, hey, this person really is our brand. They use our product. They believe in our product. And this isn't just a one-off campaign.
Right. So in the US, I mean, it really does seem like the MCN model seems to be on the way out. What do you see globally? I mean, do you think we're going to see new models emerge possibly?
The MCN model was an interesting one. And I can only speak to the position, like from the perspective of Kin, because Kin has always been kind of a bit of a different player in the space in that, at our peak, I think we worked with 150 creators globally, maybe 200. So the scale was kind of reasonable. It wasn't, these sort of thousands upon thousands that some of the larger MCNs did, which was, often people were rightly so very critical that it was really just an AdSense grab in many cases. But I do think the MCNs served a very vital purpose in that a lot of MCNs are responsible for helping a lot of the creators that are now very large scale and grow, right? And they did make a lot of the brand connections that sort of helped creators, particularly in the early days, sort of bring in revenue when the taps hadn't necessarily opened yet necessarily. To your point, though, do I think that model has dwindled? Absolutely. I think as the business has evolved, I think the agents have sort of filled that void a little bit more. Agents and managers have sort of stepped in where MCNs once were. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a need necessarily anymore, particularly with all the other players that have come into this space to sort of have a business that aggregates creators and their network like that. I think brands now are savvier. Like a lot of times too, in the early days, brands weren't really, very familiar with YouTube or Facebook or Instagram necessarily. And MCNs were really able to help sort of lean in on their media strategy a little bit and also just be a liaison between the creator and their people on their team. I'm sure you find the same thing in your case too. Like a lot of creators now have direct relationships. They've built the business acumen to be able to manage these partnerships on their own in an effective way. It just becomes really then an issue of scale. Like if you're a brand that wants to work with hundreds of creators on a particular campaign, what's the most effective way to go about doing that? And if you go with particular platforms like some ones you mentioned, or like hashtag paid or others, where you sort of say, okay, I want to work with a number of creators, I think those companies or companies that are a scale play like that have really had to hone in on the parts of their business that justify sort of commoditizing creators in some way on the creator side. And then on the business side, they have to basically justify that really that the creators they've selected are brand safe, that they're a brand fit. And it's not these sort of generic emails going out to a massive creators. It's like, who likes this brand? Who's engaged with this brand in the last 3 months? And sort of that very sort of baseline kind of way of approaching creators. I mean, sometimes it blows my mind when brands engage with platforms like that, because I think if you were to equate it to almost say picking actors for a $100,000 or $200,000 commercial that you're creating, there is no way that you would go through a platform, right, that would necessarily just sort of spit out some people based on algorithms or demos. You would have the responsibility to make sure that they had the look and feel and brand values that you encompass. And so that's where I always just find that kind of interesting. As a first point, to have someone whittle down a list for you to say, here are 40 people I think would be a great fit. Awesome. But then I think the onus really is then to say, okay, how are those 40 people? Do the homework, really look at their audience, really look at, their engagement, and then whittle that down even further. But I think that that's still where I feel like there's still some work to be done, particularly on brand and agency side.
It definitely seems like there's two trains of thought with respect to how brands and agencies look at influencer marketing. I mean, there definitely seems to be those that are primarily interested in scale. Maybe it's, they're doing more like direct response style promo code, like they want to track exactly what the sales are and traffic are of the influencers. And those folks, it seems like, care a lot less about fit and value alignment. It's much more of just kind of another marketing channel for them, really, or distribution channel for their media or their assets, And then there's others that look at it more of a traditional ambassadorship, right? Where it's, we really, this person's going to be the name and the face of our brand, and want to make sure that there's synergy there. So I don't know if we're ever going to see convergence, on those two types of thoughts, but I'm curious, like, how do you think traditional media views the digital and the social landscape? I mean, you've got, Chorus, they're this traditional kind of media company. They initially invested in Kin and then they eventually acquired it. I mean, do you think that's a sign that we're going to see more consolidation between kind of old and new media?
For sure. I mean, you've definitely seen it in the last couple of years too, with like Will Smith moving into YouTube. I think that was sort of one that everyone really started paying attention, and the Jennifer Lopez of the world. I mean, I don't know if you've looked at her YouTube channel, but it's really good. And the content it's really awesome. I mean, the thing that I've been really fortunate about is that because we had a sales partnership with Course for the last number of years, for me, the line between digital and linear, quote unquote, talent was always kind of blurry. And that, I mean, like, because we had a sales partner who was, essentially one of the biggest networks, I really, right out of the gates with Kin Canada, was like, okay, who exists within Course's roster of talent, linear talent, who actually have the ability to maybe transition over into digital, right? Because it's not a sure thing. I've had some that have and have been very successful at it. For example, like How to Cake It. Yolanda started off as the star of a show called Sugar Stars on Food Network. She's one of the biggest bakers in the world right now across Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. She transitioned incredibly well. Lauren Toyota from Hot for Food, another perfect example. Used to be a VJ, the equivalent of, here it's called Much Music, there it's MTV. She started off there and then had always had a passion for vegan cooking, went and launched her own brand, again, massively successful. Cookbooks, cookbook tours, speaking engagements, TV appearances, all that sort of still continues. On the inverse, I've then also taken creators and influencers and worked on getting them into morning shows and other sort of broadcast properties to sort of have them as, obviously from a sales perspective, but also just from a talent perspective. Here's the thing. It works in both cases if you actually create content that's ultimately designed for the audience. I think sometimes where networks in the early days, and we've all heard the successes and failures, I think where it went wrong and where it does go wrong, is when networks think, because I pull this big influencer from the digital space and put them on a linear, that means then that a whole swath of millennials that aren't watching TV are suddenly going to flock to watch the show. It doesn't happen. In the same way that if you have someone who's really big talent on, HGTV, just because you create a digital property for them doesn't mean that they're going to build an audience, because maybe they don't speak to the audience that's there. And I think that ultimately it comes down to just being really smart. That if you're like, going to take someone like Lily and put her on air, what does that look like from a digital perspective for the network, not for Lily? Because obviously it's got that part figured out. But like, what does it mean for the network? And as a network, do you value online success as much as you value eyeballs on linear? And that's where I sort of feel like there has been an evolution with networks. And I have seen a number of sort of meaningful conversations happening between networks and creators, because I think networks are also like, wait a second, if I don't put you through the lens of purely being talent, and I actually rightly think of you as being a media company, a diversified media company, and I structure our partnership in a way that's actually reflective of that, then I think the opportunity for success for both is higher.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I also think, too, where it also gets really interesting is sort of when you start looking at it globally, too, right? Because I think networks are also realizing if you invest in sort of a meaningful way in a creator's business, yes, you have sort of their ability to leverage them across all the platforms and sites you already have on the go, but then you also tap into their audience in a really interesting kind of global way. And that's where I also find it really interesting. Like if you look at, for example, Wattpad, right? And the way they've been able to, take writers that are finding a lot of success in, say, the Philippines, and then work with studios to create, a show for that country because they know there's an inherent audience. Does it always work? No. Has the model been proven yet? I don't necessarily think so. But there is something interesting in that if you're a network or a production company and you're trying to create international formats, if you ultimately are trying to say you've had a tremendous amount of success in, I don't know, pick a country, and you are then trying to build something that speaks specifically to that market, yes, obviously you can create a format that can be localized with local talent and et cetera, et cetera. But wouldn't it be interesting if you could find talent that you could kind of leverage across both? Or, particularly, again, if you're a network that appreciates that those numbers are happening online and not necessarily on broadcast, and that you can tap into that revenue in a different kind of way, then I think there's something interesting.
Do you think, to your point about these older, more traditional companies waking up and realizing that they need to treat this, digital first talent differently than, a traditional celebrity, you're also seeing the talent think about themselves in a different way too, right? Like, I think that's something that Kin US in particular has started to do, which is just develop the careers of some traditional celebrities so that they can diversify their digital presence or kind of double down on it, right? Do you think that's because of this emerging dynamic, or is it because the brand endorsement deals that they once had, it's now mandatory to have a robust social following? And they're like, oh, crap, they're not going to just partner with me anymore. I need to have like a lot of followers on Instagram and Facebook. And that's going to be one of the deliverables of this partnership. Or like, how do you think they're looking at that?
I think it's a combination of both those things. So I've had the conversation with a number of sort of linear talent, and I've also witnessed that they, a number of them have had successful runs in multiple shows and cookbooks or all those sorts of things. And yet inevitably what comes with that business is you're kind of not sitting around, everyone's working, but you're waiting for an opportunity for a network to greenlight something, right? And that process is not fast. That process can take a very long time. And that, I think, for a lot of talent, they get kind of like, well, wait a second, I feel like I'm sitting around just waiting for opportunities, or I'm hustling as much as I can, but the opportunities still aren't happening as fast as I want them to. And I think what everyone kind of, a lot of linear talent or traditional talent realized was like, wait a second here, I can build this thing. I can build a presence online in a meaningful way across social, and I can have an ownership stake in that. Right. And I think that speaks to the magic of social media, right? Not to get into it, but that's obviously like, look at Trump. He's got a megaphone on Twitter. He's not looking for any network to put him on air. It's the same thing on the content perspective, that like I can create something of value. I can create something that really speaks to what I value, what I love, what my passion points are. It takes a long time and there's no guarantee of success. But if I am successful, then I can build a global audience that I'm speaking to directly, not via a production company, not via a TV show, me directly. And in the instances where it works, and Kin has a number of these examples, it really works. And it's really interesting too, to hear talent that have had that kind of success talk about they didn't realize what that level of engagement with an audience really feels like. right? Like they all had social and people commented and whatnot, but to actually get that kind of feedback on what you're doing and the kind of content you're creating, and because they have such a hand in that too, they really, like, I've heard from a number of them say, wow, like I've really built a following here. I've really built an audience. And it's the thing that all very successful creators do. But I think when that light bulb goes off, then it's like, wow, this is amazing. And their ability to tap in those audiences is also kind of awesome.
I mean, it seems like influencer marketing still gets a pretty tiny sliver of the overall spend in the US. And I'm wondering, is it the same way globally, or do you think that's starting to change?
I think it's starting to change. Like I feel like people are still spending a lot of money in this space. Like year over year, I feel like, at least here, the brands just, their budgets for this line just continue to grow and grow. Like I've heard estimates as high as $10 billion in terms of spending in 2020. Like that's not insignificant amount of revenue. But what I feel like is going to happen, this is digressing from your point a little bit, but what I've started to witness in the last 6 months, I would say, is a real pushback on the sort of traditional quote unquote influencer. I mean, when you have a commercial that's in the middle of the Super Bowl where two influencers fall into the side of a canyon and everyone claps, do you know what I mean? That speaks to a real pushback on that idea of sort of the worst part of influencer marketing. Like influencers in the wild. I don't know if you've seen that Instagram account.
It's just like vanity for vanity's sake, basically, right?
Exactly. It's the part of our business that makes everyone who's really legitimately in it kind of cringe. And I feel like there has to be some way in the next foreseeable future here to basically separate the wheat from the sheaf. Because at their best, influencers are people who have a genuine passion and interest for something that they truly believe in and like an authentically engaged audience. And at their worst, they're people that just want to be famous for famous sake. And that's no different than traditional talent as well, right? But there's something more sort of visceral about it. And I feel like there will be a way where the people who are in it for the right reasons somehow are highlighted or prioritized in a meaningful way. So to our earlier conversation, it becomes very clear for everyone on the agency and brand side to understand who is the real deal.
Interesting. And so, I mean, kind of to wrap it up here, I mean, what do you think is next for influencer marketing globally? I mean, you mentioned, some of these other social platforms or emerging platforms like Wattpad. I mean, TikTok has taken over the world in a really short order. I mean, obviously they spent a ton of money in acquisition costs to get those users, but, I mean, what do you think is next as, some of these large brands look at their global influencer strategy?
It's always interesting. Like I kind of find like Lasso kind of interesting in that's Facebook's version of TikTok. I find that interesting because if there's anything we learn from Facebook and Instagram, that they're not, they're going to throw some dollars behind it and they're going to steal what they want to steal from other platforms, i.e. Snapchat and Instagram. So I think that will continue to grow and I think they'll throw money at it. I think anything that's sort of obviously in the sort of gaming, entertainment, live video game viewing, like that's going to continue to grow. So like caffeine, I think is still going to sort of potentially bring some interest back into the sort of live space. So I think there'll always be challengers. I think the thing is, and I think that this is what separates, I think the new platforms that will do well versus the ones that won't, are the ones that come out of the gates with a very clear value prop for creators. That is really like, if you invest the time in being on our platform, this is how you will be rewarded from a monetary perspective. Because let's face it, like everyone's in it to make money. So how do I make money? Why do I care? Because if I can just build an audience, a la Facebook a little, that's fine. But really, what's the end game? How do I actually make this a meaningful part of my diversified business?
I think that's why YouTube has been home base for so many people for so long, because it was so easy to monetize initially, right? Like after the partner program, that happened, but then basically anyone could monetize from the beginning, right? I mean, they've raised the threshold since then, but I've heard IGTV may start monetizing. Obviously Facebook has, started monetizing, but it's like, I think really getting out the gates, like you said, it's hard to convince creators to focus elsewhere on a new platform that's unproven without a real guarantee of, yielding something down the line. So that's an interesting point.
Exactly. And then it's also interesting too, because I would imagine for a lot of creators, it's a bit of a conundrum, right? Because it's a bit of a land grab, right? When a platform starts to take hold, you want to get out of the gates early so you can build an audience easier than a couple years down the road when the algorithm just kind of kicks you in the butt, right? Like, ask anyone who's tried to actually launch a YouTube channel recently. Like, it is not as easy as it used to be. So it's like creators want to get in there early enough that they can take advantage of that, the white space, but then they can also actually make money. And, Vine was a good lesson for everybody that even when it seems like it's going the right way and you've built a big audience, there's no guarantees.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Rick. How can people connect with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram as Rick W. Matthews. And that's Matthews with 2 T's. So people can find me there.
What type of content are you putting out on TikTok right now?
I honestly am just kind of farting around with it. I'm like fairly new to it, but I'm kind of loving just how easy it is to be creative. I mean, I've been an IG story fan for a long time because, it speaks to the producer in me. I love being able to create content on my phone, but TikTok's that to the next level. So are you on TikTok yet?
You're inspiring me. I'm not. And now I'm going to give it a serious look because I feel like if you can do it, then I can do it.
You can do it. Trust me. And you'll have fun doing it. And you can find all your old favorite music tracks.
Amazing. You've just listened to the Sponsored Post podcast with your host, Justin Moore. You can subscribe to hear more great interviews and episodes via Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Trending Family, you can visit trendingfamily.com. See you next time.